I hadn't planned on noticing her that way. To me, she had always just been his mom, kind, polite, and a familiar background presence whenever I came by. But that evening, something shifted. It started with something as ordinary as walking through their front door. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh laundry, the kind of comforting scent that makes a house feel lived in. She appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair tied loosely back, a few strands falling free as if they'd escaped on purpose. She smiled, not the casual smile of a neighbor or an acquaintance, but a warm, open one that seemed to pause for just a second longer on me than it should have. I told myself I was imagining it. Still, my chest felt tighter than usual, and for the first time, I realized how gracefully she carried herself. She wasn't trying to be noticed, yet every small movement drew my eyes. The way she brushed her hair back with a casual flick of her hand, the soft click of her heels against the hardwood floor, the steady calm in her voice as she asked me how school was going. My friend was still upstairs, distracted, and in those few minutes it was just the two of us. I tried not to look directly at her, afraid she might read the thoughts crossing my mind. But I noticed the small things anyway, the light catching against her earrings, the way the neckline of her blouse moved slightly when she leaned forward to set a glass of water on the table. It felt dangerous, wrong even, to see her this way. She was older, confident, someone who belonged to another part of life, a part one had no business stepping into. And yet, I couldn't help but notice the contrast between her composure and the quiet softness in her eyes when they met mine. She laughed lightly at something I said, though I can't even remember what it was. What I do remember is the way the sound filled the room, warm, genuine, and somehow directed at me alone. Her hand brushed the back of the couch as she walked past, close enough that I could feel the faintest current of air against my arm, though she never actually touched me. That was all it took. The awareness stayed with me, echoing in the silence after she left the room. By the time my friend finally came downstairs, joking and carefree as always, I had already tucked away what I was feeling. I pretended nothing had shifted, but deep inside I knew it had. The spark was small, barely more than a flicker, but it was there, undeniable and dangerous. And as much as I wanted to ignore it, part of me already knew. This was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to forget. The house grew quieter than I expected. My friend had gone upstairs, lost in whatever distraction pulled him away, leaving me alone in the living room with his mother. At first, I shifted uneasily, trying to fill the silence with the kind of small talk that feels safe. The weather, classes, how busy life seemed to get. She listened politely, nodding with that calm patience she carried so naturally. But then she did something small, something that unsettled me more than I'd admit. She leaned forward, eyes meeting mine fully, as if what I had to say mattered more than the words themselves. Most people look past you in casual conversation, but not her. Her gaze was steady, attentive, and I could feel the weight of it in my chest. She asked after a pause, her voice smooth, almost musical. I nodded, grateful for something to do, something to break the intensity building in the quiet. She moved toward the kitchen, her steps measured, heels clicking lightly against the hardwood. I followed, though I told myself it was only polite. She reached for a mug from the cabinet, and as she handed it to me, our fingers touched, barely, a brush of skin that lasted no longer than a breath. But that one small contact sent a warmth through me, quick and startling. I glanced up, half expecting her to pull away quickly, but she didn't. Instead, her expression softened, her lips curving into the faintest smile, as though she'd noticed the reaction but chose not to say a word. Steam curled from the mug between us, carrying the scent of chamomile. She gestured toward the table, and we sat, the space suddenly feeling more intimate without anyone else around. The ticking of a clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, filling the pauses between our words. We talked about nothing in particular, how she enjoyed gardening when she had the time, how she used to read late into the night before life grew too busy. Her voice carried a gentle rhythm, and I found myself leaning forward without realizing it, drawn into the cadence of her words more than the details. Every so often, our eyes met in the quiet, and something unspoken seemed to flicker there. A recognition, perhaps. A question neither of us wanted to answer too quickly. When she reached across the table to adjust the sugar bowl, her sleeve brushed my wrist. It was nothing accidental, I told myself, but I felt the softness of the fabric and the closeness of her presence. She murmured a quiet sorry with a smile that lingered, as if the apology was less about bumping me and more about acknowledging the tension neither of us named. By the time my friend's footsteps echoed down the stairs, the moment had folded back into something ordinary. Just tea at the kitchen table. Just polite conversation. But the silence that had stretched between us still clung to me. Richer, heavier, impossible to forget. And as I left that evening, the taste of chamomile lingering faintly on my tongue, I realized it wasn't the tea that had left me restless. It was her. The next time I came over, it wasn't supposed to be anything different. I told myself that the strange awareness I'd felt last time was just in my head, a fleeting moment, nothing more. But as soon as she opened the door, the thought vanished. She was dressed simply, a loose sweater and jeans, hair tied back with a clip. Yet there was something disarming in the casualness, the way she looked at me with that same steady warmth, as if she was quietly amused by my awkwardness. "My son's out running an errand," she said lightly. "But you can wait here, if you don't mind keeping me company for a bit." Company. The word felt too small for the way it stirred me. I nodded, stepping inside, trying to appear relaxed, though every sense in me was sharpened to her presence. She led me toward the garage, asking if I could help carry a box that had been sitting there for weeks. It wasn't heavy, not really, but it gave me an excuse to stand close, to catch the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the dust of cardboard and cedar. We lifted it together, her hand on one side, mine on the other. Our arms brushed as we adjusted our grip, and I felt the heat of her skin even through the fabric of her sweater. She leaned slightly against me as we maneuvered it through the doorway, laughing softly when the corner nearly scraped the wall. Her laugh, it was low, unguarded, the kind of sound that made my chest tighten. For a moment, it was easy to forget who she was supposed to be to me. She wasn't just my friend's mom. She was a woman, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, smiling at me as though we shared a secret. When we finally set the box down, she placed her hand lightly on my arm, steadying herself. It lasted no more than a second, but it was enough. My pulse quickened under her touch, and when she withdrew, I almost wished she hadn't. "Thank you," she said, her eyes lifting to mine. There was nothing unusual in the words, yet the way she held my gaze made it feel heavier, like she was saying more than gratitude. I managed to quiet any time, though my throat felt dry. We lingered there in the garage longer than necessary, neither of us rushing back into the house. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, filled with the echo of that brief closeness. When we did step back inside, the spell softened, but it didn't vanish. Something had shifted again. I could sense it in the way her smile lingered, and how my own steps felt unsteady, as if I were walking along a line I wasn't supposed to cross but couldn't help drifting toward. And for the first time, I began to wonder if she felt it too. Evening always seemed to change the way her house felt. During the day, it was filled with noise, footsteps, doors opening and closing, the easy rhythm of family life. But at night, when the lights dimmed and only a few warm lamps glowed in the living room, everything grew softer, quieter, and somehow more intimate. That night, I found myself sitting on the edge of the couch, flipping idly through my phone while I waited for my friend to finish a call upstairs. She was in the armchair across from me, her legs crossed, a book resting loosely in her lap. The silence stretched comfortably, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional turn of a page. I told myself not to look, but my eyes wandered anyway. The lamplight touched her hair, catching the strands that had fallen free from her clip. Her posture was graceful, relaxed, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. She wasn't trying to be noticed. That was the dangerous part. And still, I couldn't stop noticing. At one point, she glanced up from her book and caught me looking. For a heartbeat, I froze, ready to look away, but she didn't let me. Her eyes held mine, calm, unhurried, as though she'd been expecting it. The corner of her lips curved upward, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement. It wasn't the kind of glance people exchange by accident. Something in the air shifted. My chest tightened, and suddenly I was too aware of the space between us, too aware of how much I wanted to close it. She set the book down, leaning slightly forward, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The movement was small, ordinary, but the way her gaze stayed fixed on me made it feel intentional. My throat grew dry, and I had to remind myself to breathe. When she stood and walked past me toward the kitchen, her hand brushed the back of the couch near my shoulder. It wasn't a touch, not quite, but the nearness of it sent a current up my spine. She poured herself a glass of water, then returned, this time choosing the cushion at the far end of the couch instead of her armchair. The distance between us was polite, but not impersonal. Her knee angled slightly toward mine, close enough that if either of us shifted even an inch, we'd touch. We spoke then, though I couldn't recall much of what was said. The words were unimportant. What mattered was the way she looked at me when I spoke, her eyes lingering long enough to make my pulse stumble. And every time she glanced away, it was with the air of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. When my friend finally came downstairs, the moment dissolved, smoothed over by casual laughter and the bustle of plans. But in the back of my mind, I carried the memory of her gaze, steady, unflinching, and far too knowing. That was the night I realized the silence between us wasn't just silence anymore. It was something alive, breathing, waiting. It happened on a night when the rain wouldn't stop. The sound of it filled the house, tapping against the windows, rolling steady across the roof. My friend had left to meet someone, promising he'd be back later, which meant once again it was just the two of us. She offered me a seat in the kitchen, the soft glow of the overhead light wrapping us in a kind of shelter from the storm outside. There was no rush in her movements that night. She seemed quieter than usual, her smile carrying a touch of weariness I hadn't noticed before. At first, we spoke of simple things, the weather, the storm, the way the power flickered now and then. But gradually, her voice softened, and she let slip pieces of herself that felt different from the polished calm she usually carried. You know, she said, staring into her cup of tea, sometimes it feels like I've spent my whole life making sure everyone else is all right. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself if I was. The words hung between us, heavy in the warm kitchen air. I didn't know what to say right away. She wasn't the type of woman to complain. She was always composed, steady, the kind of presence others leaned on. But tonight, that composure had slipped, revealing something gentler, more fragile. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, trying to match the honesty she had just given me. "That sounds exhausting," I said quietly. "I don't think anyone's ever really all right all the time. Not even you." She laughed softly, a broken little sound that wasn't amusement so much as release. When her eyes lifted to mine, I saw the vulnerability there, the quiet longing of someone who carried too much alone. Her hands fidgeted with the rim of her mug, fingers tracing absent circles. Without thinking too hard, I reached across the table and let my hand rest gently over hers. For a second, I feared she might pull away, that I had overstepped. But she didn't. Instead, her fingers still beneath mine, then slowly turned upward, her thumb brushing lightly across my knuckle. The touch was soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a warmth coursing through me. It felt like a silent confession, an acknowledgement of the closeness neither of us dared put into words. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice quiet, almost fragile. "It's nice being listened to." I nodded, though I couldn't find the right words to answer. The rain kept falling outside, steady and relentless, But inside the kitchen, the silence between us grew thick, alive with the weight of her vulnerability and the closeness of our joined hands. Eventually, she pulled back gently, smiling as though she needed to smooth away what had just happened. But the softness in her eyes lingered. And even when my friend returned later, filling the house with noise again, I carried the memory of that moment. Her voice trembling, her hand beneath mine, as something I knew I'd never forget. It was late, later than I meant to stay. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with the scent of rain and damp earth drifting in through a cracked window. The house was quiet, too quiet. My friend had fallen asleep upstairs, and for the first time that night, I realized I was alone with her again. She was in the living room, the soft glow of a single lamp painting the space in gold and shadow. She sat curled into the couch, legs tucked beneath her, a throw blanket draped loosely across her lap. When I stepped into the room, she looked up and smiled in a way that made my pulse stumble. Not polite, not casual, but warm, knowing as if she'd been waiting. "Still here?" she teased gently, her voice low, almost playful. I lost track of time, I admitted, settling uneasily into the other end of the couch. My chest felt tight, every sense of mine sharpened to her nearness. For a moment, silence stretched between us. She studied me quietly, her eyes soft, searching, as though she could see all the hesitations I was too afraid to name. I looked away, but the air between us seemed to pull tighter, charged with everything unspoken. Then, softly, she broke it. "You're nervous," she said. Not accusing, not mocking, just simple truth. Her hand rested lightly on the blanket, fingers brushing the fabric, as if testing whether I'd notice. My throat felt dry. "I don't want to," she leaned closer, cutting off the rest of my sentence, her voice dropping to a hush. "Don't be shy." Her words alone made my breath catch, but then her smile deepened, calm, steady, reassuring. "I'll take the lead," she whispered, as though promising me there was nothing to fear. Her hand slid across the cushion, slow and deliberate, until her fingers found mine. The contact was gentle at first, tentative, but when she felt me respond, she laced her fingers with mine, her touch warm, steadying. The world seemed to narrow to that point of connection. My heart raced, but her calmness anchored me. She leaned in, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek, close enough that the faint scent of her perfume wrapped around me like a secret. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. "Just let this be." Time slowed. Every small detail pressed itself into my memory. The softness of her voice, the way her knee brushed against mine, the steadiness of her gaze holding me still. For the first time, I stopped resisting the pull between us and let myself sink into it. And in that quiet, golden-lit room, with her fingers entwined in mine and her words still echoing in my chest, I realized I was no longer just standing at the edge of something forbidden. I was already inside it, carried by her calm, assured presence. The moment after was strangely calm. I had expected my chest to be racing, my thoughts tangled, but instead there was only a steady stillness, as though time itself had exhaled. She was still close, her hand resting in mine, her thumb tracing small, absent patterns across my skin. Neither of us spoke right away. Words would have broken something fragile, something that didn't need to be explained. Instead, we sat there in the hush of the living room, surrounded by the soft glow of the lamp and the faint hum of the house settling in the night. Eventually, she shifted slightly, drawing the blanket higher around her shoulders. Without thinking, I adjusted with her, sliding closer until our arms brushed. She didn't pull away. If anything, she leaned into it, her head finding its place against my shoulder with a quiet sigh. The weight of her was gentle, grounding. I could feel the warmth of her cheek through my shirt, the subtle rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine. It was such a small closeness, yet it felt immense, more intimate than anything we had shared before. "I don't know what this is," I admitted softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My voice sounded rough, uncertain. She lifted her head, just enough to look at me, her eyes steady but kind. "It doesn't have to be defined tonight," she said. "Not everything needs a name right away." Her words soothed me, though they also stirred something deeper, a longing for this quiet understanding to last. I nodded, too full of feeling to press further, and she smiled as though she understood exactly what I couldn't say. We stayed like that for a long time, the silence between us no longer charged with hesitation, but with comfort. Every so often, her hand would squeeze mine gently, and I would respond, each touch a reassurance that neither of us was imagining this. The night stretched on. The house was still, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and new beginnings. When she finally rose, it wasn't abrupt. She moved slowly, reluctantly, as if she too wanted to linger. She pressed the blanket into my lap with a soft laugh. "You'll catch a chill if you sit here all night," she teased, though her voice carried a tenderness that made the words feel less like a joke and more like a promise. I stood as well, and for a moment we faced each other in the quiet. Then she stepped closer and wrapped her arms lightly around me. Her embrace wasn't hurried. It was gentle, steady, her cheek resting against my chest. I held her back, feeling the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat against mine. When she pulled away, there was no rush in her movements. Just one last smile, soft and knowing, before she whispered, "Good night." As I left the house that night, the world outside felt different. Not brighter, not darker, but changed. And though nothing had been declared, nothing made official, I carried the warmth of her touch with me, certain of one thing. Some connections don't need labels. They only need to be felt.